whether or not the parts of the soul are really our parts, or whether the soul works as a unity. Because if the soul works as a unity, you couldn't make all these points. So therefore, would you agree to communicate what you see to someone else in a systematic way is another part of philosophy. But the core, the practice, is this.
But you start from the practice, and then it's the opposite way that he's normally been doing. Reach philosophy at the end rather than the... You start with the yoga, and eventually the outcome of the yoga is the philosophy.
Yeah, this is a yoga, but if you want to communicate it to others and make it into a coherent system, then you have to break out of just being a spiritual practice and use the mind to communicate and to nail down all of these distinctions in a very fine way. Yeah.
I was wondering if this is correct.
Good.
With respect to Proclus's Elements of Theology, I saw you once say that something, you take something, it can, with respect to its communication, it can be three things. It can be deficient, full, or overflowing. And then you said one part of philosophy was the practice, the other part of the practice was the communication of it. Is the practice to being full as the communication is to the overfilling?
The overfilling or overflowing, I think, is another way of putting it. Maybe if you stretch it, it might be possible. In communicating, it's a procession. Some processions are overflowing, right? In Proclus, he makes a distinction between procession, declension, as you're probably familiar with when he talks about the soul. A declension is when the soul... He has the question of whether soul as a cosmic thing, how the soul then can generate, as it were, particular souls. And he talks about that as a kind of overflowing. He talks about it as a kind of overflowing, but he talks about it as a declension, because it's a diminutive form, smaller form, of the cosmic soul, and therefore that follows the idea of a declension, right? Parting, where parts of itself emerge. If you want to go to, well, that's 1/3 of your question. Started also with satisfying, did you not? Wasn't it? Self-sufficient is what he would call it. That the soul is self-sufficient. This is saying soul is self-sufficient in the sense that you don't need anything from other than what you possess to achieve your goal. In that sense, it's self-sufficient.
What's the lawgiver in the soul then?
Well, see, the lawgiver in the soul is not in the soul, right? You'd have to get this somewhere, and that's why he talks about the education of the soul. No, this is not in the soul. That's part of philosophy or your culture.
What is the top section of the soul?
The ruling function. The ruling function.
The ruling function.
Reason of the ruling.
It's not the lawgiver. The ruling function is like the bottom part of the mean analogy to...
Well, the ruling function is what you do with what you have. How you then
Right, but can you remember last week you had the 5 circles, and I'm saying that so...
Yeah, or circles, yeah.
Right. So could you have the lawgiver to the ruling section of the soul have meaning allowed?
The only way the ruler is the same as the lawgiver would be if the individual confirmed all of this in their experience. Then they would be the lawgiver. But this is the education of the soul, and therefore it assumes in the beginning that you don't have that, which is why you have to believe it.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. So it's confirmable, but...
Are you saying that they're not stating that the literal practice of music and gymnastics with one's mind directed towards the high-spirited part of our nature will strengthen that high-spirited part and therefore give one courage? Are you saying it has nothing to do with the literal practice of music and gymnastics?
Yeah, as you heard the description of music, would you agree it didn't sound like learning scales or playing any instrument?
Well, looking at, for example, a text on martial arts.
Yeah.
In the martial arts, there's the outer martial arts and there's the inner martial arts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're considered to be complementary. So.
Well,
I mean,
yes.
It's considered higher.
Oh yes.
Sometimes.
Oh yes. Yes, you might be able to do that, except for one word in this description. He's saying you're not going to become musical yourself or getting others musical until. So that's the condition for it. If you're thinking then that the condition for it is something, the inner working, yes, I think you're right. If we agree on that, yeah. But that's certainly not the outer form of music or the outer form of martial arts.
It would affect the outer form.
I'm not sure about that. I imagine that there can, I don't think, no, I don't think so. Well, I'm not sure about that. Let me make sure. We're asking whether or not twins would be studying music the way in which Plato describes, and one would study it this way and the other would not, but would study it traditionally. And whether or not they had to master the same external form of music, whether they would be different musicians as a consequence of both the inner and the outer, as we're now expressing it. It may be that in mastering music, they may have to go through a certain kind of discipline or pain, as discipline sometimes is anguish to go through it and to practice monotonous things or certain things, and to keep that state of mind going through the whole, as well as not to be too swayed by the pleasure. Very likely, yeah. Okay, yeah. In that sense, yeah, I go along with it. Yeah, that's right. Okay, how to reason my way through that.
But this music could be any music. In mastering,
That's
let's
right.
say mathematics, you're going through exactly the same type of things, or any.
Well, with mathematics, see, this is the beginning. Now, there is a higher, much more higher education of the soul once we get into the formal training of the philosopher king. This is the precondition for him. Then we have to go into arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmony, and dialectic.